A very warm greeting to all of you, those who are joining this very special sessions led by Stephen. And Stephen Batchelor needs no introduction as such, those who are familiar with what's happening in the Buddhist intellectual world or in terms of what is happening in the contemporary Buddhist world. But by a way of kickstarting the session, I would just have a line or two to introduce Stephen. Stephen has been a very profound practitioner of Buddhism, and he is somebody who is very special in terms of his practice in several Buddhist traditions, and they are like very diverse sort of traditions, like Korean tradition, Tibetan tradition, and he has uh, been into practicing Buddhism for over 4 decades now. One of his remarkable qualities is this, that the kind of thinking he brings to Buddhism in terms of a very fresh look at the various practices and terminologies that sometimes lead us in a different direction. He's somebody who would be clarifying lot of terminologies, lot of practices, and not only that, but how those that explanation or that understanding can be brought to having uh, a kind of importance in the modern day. So he has written a lot. He has written on the traditional Buddhist text. He has written on very complex text like Madhyamika, Mulu Madhyamika, and so on and so forth. But one of the things that now he's doing is to talk about Buddhism for the modern world in terms of what we can say, what he calls a secular Buddhism. And we have seen how he has been approaching that particular, area in a lecture that he delivered a month back. So this has been, kind of personally an exploration for me, of the ideas which have been, brought there by Stephen. And last time we met, and he was very keen on, running a kind of a session or a course for the followers of Baba Sahib Ambedkar. So we thought that this will be a beginning sort of, an activity towards something which we can take on in the future. And that's why we have this sessions, 4 sessions, which will be talking about Four Noble Truths in a very interesting way. He's going to in the first, he defines the Four Noble Truths in terms of what he calls the 4 great tasks. And today he's going to look at embrace life. And the next he's going to look at let creativity be, let reactivity be. No, sorry, let reactivity be. And in the third, he's going to look at see reactivity stop. And in the final one, he's going to look at actualize a path. So I'm going to straight away invite Stephen to begin with his session. So welcome, Stephen, and all of you. For I hope it is going to be a remarkable journey of the 4 weeks. So welcome, Stephen.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mangesh, for that introduction. And as Mangesh has already said, I'm very eager and also very honored to be able to share my ideas with your community. And by that, I mean whoever's listening now, but particularly those who have been brought up in the broad tradition that has followed upon the work of Baba Sahib Ambedkar and is now emerging, I think, as a really powerful force in India, not just as another form of Buddhism, but as a significant social and political movement. But what I'm going to be focusing on is, as Mangesh already said, the 4 great tasks. Now, Mangesh, like many others, sees this as another way of looking at the Four Noble Truths. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Four Noble Truths. In nearly every Buddhist tradition that exists on earth, they would regard the Four Noble Truths as the kind of the bedrock, the foundation, the core ideas on the basis of which all of the different diverse Buddhist traditions and practices can be built. Now, without getting into too much scholarly detail, over the course of time, I've come to see not the Four Noble Truths, but the tasks that are related to each one as being the bedrock, as being the foundation on which the rest of the Buddhist tradition is built. And we find this idea of these tasks, we find the idea of these tasks in the very first discourse that Gautama gave, the turning of the wheel of Dharma. He doesn't actually use the word task, but when at the conclusion of the discourse, he comes to define what it means to be fully awake, he describes this as one of having recognized, performed, and mastered four tasks in relation to the four basic facts of life. And I'd rather use the term facts of life as opposed to noble truths. These four facts of life, the first one is suffering, or we might just simply say being alive, being subject to birth, sickness, aging, death, being alive. The second fact is the fact of reactivity, that in encountering situations in life, we are reactive creatures and we immediately experience a like or dislike, desire or fear, opinions. They naturally rise up in our minds as soon as we find ourselves in a human situation. The third fact is that it's also just as matter of fact that we also know what it's like to be non-reactive. That there's also a part of us that is not caught up in what we desire, what we fear, what our views and opinions are. It's a basic inner clarity and stillness that is a non-reactive mind. And the third fact is that our life is one that's always pathing. We're always going somewhere. We're never standing still. And we could be going somewhere just through the habits of our culture and our religion, that we just follow what our parents encourage us to do and what we're taught to do. But if we engage with a spiritual practice like Buddhism, then we also find ourselves faced with the challenge not only of following a path, but actually of creating, of sustaining, of developing a path. So these four facts, suffering, reactivity, non-reactivity, and pathing, are the basis or the foundation on which we can then consider how should we act appropriately in regard to these four things. And today we're going to be looking at the first task, as Mangesh already mentioned, which is about embracing life or comprehending life. I'll come on to that in more detail as we go ahead. But before we get into the details of this first task, I'd like to just make a few remarks about the idea of the four tasks themselves. I understand these tasks as being essentially the practice of ethics, whereas I see the Four Noble Truths as having more to do with asking us to adopt certain beliefs that life is suffering, that the origin of suffering is craving or ignorance, and so on. If we begin with tasks rather than truths, we begin already with the notion that the practice of the Dharma, Buddhism, is basically about how we live, what we do, and in particular, how we live in such a way that we become the kind of person that we aspire to be. And this kind of person is symbolized in Buddhism by the image of the Buddha or the Bodhisattvas. For some of you, it might be more a figure in history, like Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, for example, or Thich Nhat Hanh, or the Dalai Lama, or an historical figure in Buddhism or in another religious tradition, or a philosopher. There are people who serve as our role models in life. And ethics is the practice, the conscious practice of seeking to lead a life on this earth from moment to moment, from day to day, in which we live up to the kind of ideal that is modeled in the Buddha, in Babasaheb Ambedkar, or others that we take as examples of what a human being can be. So in other words, this practice of these four tasks, if we put them together, is the task of actually creating, bringing into being a kind of person. The word ethics comes from the Greek word ethos, which means something like character. It's a process of developing our character, becoming, if we value kindness, becoming more kind. If we value wisdom, becoming more wise. But at the same time, remembering that these qualities are not independent mental states, but they are features of a human person, the man or the woman that we are. And in other words, this practice of the Dharma through these four tasks is about the practice of being or becoming fully human. Now, we've spoken of four tasks, but these four tasks can actually be boiled down to one core ethical value, and that is the value of care. Now, the word I'm translating for care in Pali is apamada. In Sanskrit, that's apramada. Quite a central term in Buddhism, but one that's not really settled yet with a common English translation. Sometimes it's translated as diligence, sometimes as heedfulness, sometimes as conscientiousness. It's a little bit unclear how to render this in English. I choose the word care, following an example of another translator, a German translator, and I feel that it's a broad enough term that can encompass all of these four tasks. We find in one discourse in the early Buddhist texts, the Buddha comparing this quality of care, or apamada, to the elephant's footprint. In other words, at the time of the Buddha, when a lot of the monks would have lived on the edge of villages or towns, they would have spent time in the forests, they would have been very familiar with the footprints left by the different animals that were around at that time. And they would have known that the footprint of the elephant is the biggest footprint there is. And inside that footprint, you can put the footprints of all the other animals, a leopard or a deer or a dog or whatever it might be, that their footprint can always be contained within the footprint of the elephant. Now, it's in this sense that care encompasses all other virtues. Care is the framework within which the practice of virtue takes place. In other texts, the Buddha compares the Four Noble Truths to the elephant's footprint. In other words, in my reading, the four tasks are also a shorthand for this all-encompassing framework within which our practice of becoming fully human takes place. To give some suggestion of how central the idea of care was for the Buddha, We find it in his very last recorded saying, where he says, and this is my translation, "Things fall apart, tread the path with care." On another occasion, he says, "All virtues merge or come together in care." So clearly, it's a very central idea, and one that I hope to reflect more upon as we continue through these 4 weeks to look at these 4 tasks. In other words, I'm going to treat these 4 tasks as a way of analyzing what it means to care, to analyzing what perhaps the Buddha himself understood by this term caring, appamada. So we've already looked at these 4 tasks. I'm not going to say any more about that now, but I'm going to focus very specifically on the first task, which in Pali is dukkha parinya, which literally translated would be something like fully know suffering. Fully know suffering. Parinya, nya is to know in the Indic languages. Pari means something like around, like a parikrama is a circumambulation around a temple or a mountain. So it's a kind of knowing, but it's not a knowing that has to do with knowing particular details. It's knowing in the round, knowing something fully. And that's why I choose the word embrace. So embrace suffering. But since suffering here includes birth and sickness and aging and death, it includes the 5 aggregates too, for example, it means more than just moments of pain or difficulty that we might face in life. It really is shorthand for life itself, in the sense, not the biological life, but rather in the sense when we say, when something really, problematic or difficult or disappointing happens, we say in English, well, that's life. In other words, life is the kind of experience in which these kinds of things happen. There's nothing much you can do about it. You can't avoid getting old and dying, for example. You can't avoid things happening that you would rather did not happen. There is a givenness to life that includes great tragedy. It also includes great joy and love and compassion and well-being. Everything is included under this framework, under this rubric. So to fully know this life. Now, this, of course, only begs another question, namely, what does it mean to fully know something, to pari? What does pari mean here? Well, fortunately, we have a passage in the connected discourses of the Buddha, the Samyutta Nikaya, where the Buddha is actually asked that question. What do you mean by parinya, fully knowing, embracing, comprehending? And the Buddha says, to fully know means to know something without attachment, without aversion, or without opinionatedness. Now, this is my rendering of what are often translated as greed, hatred, and delusion, sometimes called the 3 fires, sometimes called the 3 poisons. They're the basic triad of emotional, mental turmoil, or in a way, a kind of a reactive habits and patterns that are constantly rising up within us. They, in fact, describe quite well what we'll be looking at next week, which is the second task, is about letting reactivity be. In other words, letting attachment, aversion, opinionatedness, just let it be. Don't get caught up in it. But we can go back to that later. What's interesting, I find here, is that parinya, embracing, comprehending, fully knowing, doesn't have to do with what it is that you know. What it has to do with the kind of mind, the kind of relationship you have to what you know. It's to know something without grasping, without fearing, and without immediately having an opinion about it or feeling confused about it. Being able to just be with it as it is in that moment. Now, there are three other terms that Gautama, the Buddha, defines with exactly the same words. And they are nirvana, the deathless, the amata, and the unconditioned, the asankata. So unconditioned, deathless, nirvana, and embracing are given exactly the same definition. Now, this might strike you as strange. It might strike you as so strange that you think maybe there's a mistake in the text. I don't think so. I think what this shows is something very, very central to what this first task is about. This first task, embracing life without attachment, without aversion, without opinions, is already a nirvanic condition. So although nirvana might often be thought of as the summum bonum, the great goal of the Buddhist path, here we have the Buddha quite clearly pointing out that if we can embrace our life without attachment or aversion or opinionatedness, we are already in a nirvanic state. Not, some great mystical experience necessarily, but we have nonetheless come to recognize our situation in a way that we're able to look at it in a non-reactive way. The third task, see reactivity from non-reactivity for what it is. And this is further illustrated by another passage in the discourses, and this is found in the numerical discourses, the Anguttara Nikaya. And it's a series of very short discourses. They're not really discourses, they're just statements, really, each of which is more or less identical, but in each case, a different person's name is given as the subject of this statement. There are 21 such suttas, statements, and 21 people, each of whom have achieved a particular state of knowledge, liberation, and virtue. What is striking is that every one of these 21 people are householders. They're not monks, they're not nuns, they've not taken any religious vows. They are people who are working in business, who are working in government, who are doctors, who are rulers, people involved in all aspects of the worldly life. And in each of these cases, they are described to be people who have found fulfillment in the Tathagata, again, a tricky word, but let's translate it as the true person. They're people who have found fulfillment in who they really are, their true personhood. They have become seers of the deathless. So again, this deathless, nirvana, unconditioned, these are people who have seen the deathless in the same way as one does in the third task of seeing non-reactivity. And they go about their business, their activities, their bodily activity, from the perspective of the deathless. And they have 6 qualities. They have lucid trust in the Buddha, lucid trust in the Dharma, lucid trust in the Sangha. They have achieved noble virtue, noble understanding, and noble liberation. Now, this is a text, a short text, that has actually given quite some problem to Buddhist scholars in the Theravada school and elsewhere, because normally these kinds of qualities are not attributed to householders, but to monks who are considered to be very advanced in their practice. So there's an oddity about this text. I find it very engaging, because it seems to highlight the fact that at the Buddha's time, those of his followers who had, in a way, put his teaching into practice and made it a part of their lives in a very real way, here and now, are to be found amongst people doing business, in government, in medicine, in all kinds of careers in the world. So from a secular point of view, which is the one that I'll be coming back to again and again, we have here a very early text that suggests that at the Buddha's time, it was not just the monks and the nuns and the people who meditated all the time who achieved insight into nirvana, but it's people in the world like us. In other words, what this points to is a practice of the Dharma that has to do with this world, living fully in this world, but doing so completely within the frame of Buddhist practice. And I think for many of us today, perhaps who have no particular interest or vocation to become a monastic, this offers, as it were, a way of Buddhist practice that doesn't give such importance to long sessions of meditation or going on retreat or going into the forest, but has to do with recognizing how our lives can be realized within the framework of everyday life in the world. And I think, of course, in your context, a figure such as Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar embodies this as well as anyone in the last century. I think he was a living example, frankly, of someone who found fulfillment in the Tathagata, was a seer of the deathless, and went about his business from that perspective. So, as followers of Dr. Ambedkar, and I would include myself, I see that his not only what he said, but how he lived his life is already a teaching, an illustration of what this practice can be about. So that gives us some sense of how we can understand Parinya, embracing, fully knowing, comprehending life or comprehending suffering, which is the first of these 4 tasks. I need to add something more, though. I think in what I've said so far, I've only really highlighted the sort of experience of embracing life that would take place in a particular moment. You go about your business from the perspective of the deathless. You don't have attachment, aversion, or opinionatedness, but it's still very much something that you would seek to achieve as you live your life from day to day, from week to week, to month. I think we have to expand our understanding of embracing life, not only to how we go about living from day to day, but also how we understand how we wish to lead this life in its entirety. There's an emphasis that is quite common in many Buddhist traditions today to give a lot of attention to the present moment, particularly in America and in Europe, where Buddhism is popular. It's often presented as a practice whereby you learn to be more still, to be more centered, to be more mindful in whatever situation you find yourself. And it's presented very much as a psychological practice, something that you can do courses in, that you can get, you can improve your ability to be more still and more mindful. And that can certainly affect the quality of your life in a very positive way. But when we look more deeply into the Buddhist tradition, and here I'm talking not only of Theravada Buddhism, but also of Sarvastivada Buddhism, which was the early form of Buddhism to have developed on the main subcontinent of India rather than in Sri Lanka, where the Theravada was developed. We find that this understanding of embracing life extends through what is called the path of formation. I forget what it is in Sanskrit. The path of formation. So corresponding to the 4 tasks, and we'll see this as we go through this series of presentations, corresponding to each task is a path. Embracing life, the first task, occurs on what is called the path of formation. Letting reactivity be, the second task, takes place on what is called the path of unification. Seeing the stopping of reactivity occurs on the path of seeing, which is sensible enough, and cultivating a path takes place on the path which is also called cultivation and has to do with cultivating the Eightfold Path. That's just to give you a sketch. But my own gut feeling is that this doctrine of the 4 paths, which is found throughout the Sarvastivada tradition, going back to figures like Vasubandhu in India, and also found its way into Tibet and has become the basic framework for understanding the path to awakening in all the Tibetan Buddhist schools, is these 4 paths of formation, unification, seeing, and cultivation. My hunch is that at some early point, the Buddha spoke not so much of truths, not so much of tasks, but of paths. What is strange is that in the Pali Canon and in the Theravada school that is built around the Pali Canon, these 4 paths are not mentioned at all. They're completely alien to that tradition. Why? I don't know. But when I trained as a Tibetan Buddhist monk, these 4 paths were absolutely central to everything we studied. And they came to us not through the Theravada school, but through the Sarvastivada school. Now, what these paths also teach us is that each path is associated with a particular set of virtues. In traditional Buddhism, these are usually called the 37 wings of awakening. In fact, there's really only 32, and I'm going to focus just on 32. 32 virtues or wings of awakening. And on the path of formation, we find 3 central virtues that are to be cultivated while we're engaged in the process of embracing life. And as you'll see, this is something much more far-reaching than just being psychologically able to embrace life without attachment and hatred. The first central quality that we cultivate on the path of formation and thereby within the practice of embracing life is mindfulness. And this involves mindfulness of the physical world and of the body. It includes mindfulness of feelings and emotions. It includes mindfulness of your state of mind or the state of your soul. And it includes mindfulness of the guiding ideas and frames of the practice itself, the dharmas. So mindfulness, again, is a simple idea, to be mindful of this or that, one's breath, one's body. But when the Buddha presents it in this rather more detailed way, we find that it has to do with the totality of our experience. The capacity to be mindful, which means to be still, to be attentive, to be noticing what's going on rather than endlessly distracted by this, that, or the other. It's a mindfulness that encompasses the physical world, it encompasses the body, it encompasses how we feel, our state of mind, and it encompasses those ideas that are central to how we live our lives as ethical beings. So as you know, there are 4 mindfulnesses, and these 4 are all included here under the heading of mindfulness. So mindfulness in this sense would be, for example, also being mindful of one's history, for example, ideas, aware of one's history, and one's history not just as an individual, one's history as the member of a community or a society or of a nation. So to be mindful of what it is in the past that has led to your having, the kind of life that you have now. To not forget that, to recognize what one's parents and ancestors and other figures in the society have done in order that you and I are able to enjoy the kind of life that we live now. I think this mindfulness also has to do with a mindfulness of evolution, of how we came about through millions of years, evolving from single-celled organisms into more complex forms of life, through amphibians, into primates, into the great apes, and finally into Homo sapiens. I think we have to extend the idea of mindfulness from being a kind of spiritual exercise, which is clearly important, but to expand the idea of mindfulness to include a broader awareness of the kind of world, the kind of universe, the kind of reality that we inhabit here and now, that depends upon this extraordinary sequence of physical and subatomic and cultural forces that have led us to be where we are now. So to comprehend life, to embrace life, has to do with embracing and understanding the extent of life as it has made our own particular lives, these brief 60, 70 years, if we're lucky, on Earth. That is something that we need to constantly refer back to and be mindful of. The second central virtue here on the path of formation is resolve. Resolve, in Pali that's padana. Resolution, resolve, commitment, motivation, all of these words would come into play here. And in particular, this resolve has to do with focusing your life on what matters most for you. And that, of course, requires that we identify what it is that we want to make of ourselves in this life, of what we seek to achieve for our friends, our family, our community, our nation, and to then, in a way, heighten our consciousness of what matters most for us, and to dedicate ourselves in the way that someone like Babasaheb Ambedkar dedicated himself, not just for his own personal improvement, far from it, but actually for his community, for his people, and to do so without ever wavering from that task, no matter how many obstacles get in your way, how much difficulty is involved. Your resolve is something that needs to remain constant. There's a discourse in the Sutta Nipata called the Pardana Sutta, the discourse on resolve. And it's the discourse in which we find the story of the Buddha's renunciation, his temptation by Mara, the devil, and his overcoming of Mara. It's a very beautiful text. It's quite short. It's only about 20 or so verses, but it gives a very vivid account, albeit, in the cultural language of the 5th century BCE, in other words, a long time ago. But nonetheless, you get what comes through very clearly there is that this young man, Siddhartha Gautama, was focusing his life on what mattered the most for him. And that was to find some kind of resolution to the question of what it means to be human, what it means to be free, what it means to be good, and so forth and so on. And we know the legend of him sitting beside the Narayana River near Bodh Gaya and exerting himself through asceticism and deep meditation, and finally achieving his goal on the full moon of the 4th lunar month beneath the Bodhi tree. Now, whether we take that to be historically literally true, or whether this is a more mythical way of explaining this process, is up for you to decide. But the point remains that what was central in his quest was his resolve to achieve his goals and to not let anything, even the devil, even Mara, the armies of Mara, stand in his way. So embracing life in this broader sense has to do with mindfulness, which again is now expanded. And it also has to do with resolve, which is not just the resolve to complete this course of studies or finish this retreat or to be a good monk or a nun. It's a resolve to focus your life on what matters most for you and to stay constant and committed to that goal. So we have mindfulness, we have resolve, and then the third central virtue that we have on this path of formation is creativity. Creativity. Now, often when you study Buddhism, you don't hear much talk about creativity. And you might be wondering, well, where am I getting this from? Usually, and I would say in virtually every translation, you will find of these virtues that I'm talking about now, creativity will be translated as miraculous powers. And it will include things like walking through walls, walking on water, multiplying the number of bodies you have, touching the sun and the moon, it says. And this is the standard way in which Buddhism has presented creativity. I am convinced that it's nothing to do with walking through walls or flying in the sky. It has to do with creatively activating your imagination. And the reason that creativity is important on this path is because if we're going to live fully in this world, we need to be mindful, we need to be resolute, we need to have resolve, but we also need to have the creative capacity to solve the problems that face us. In other words, we can be fully aware of who we are, our bodies, our minds, all of our feelings and so on. We can be totally committed to realizing a certain goal in life, but that's not enough. We also have to have the creative power to not only identify the goals that we're focused upon, but learning the skills that we require in order to achieve those goals. We need to imagine a life in which we are able to fulfill our deepest longings, are able to realize what we have resolved ourselves to attain. And this has to do in practice with solving problems. It has to do with encountering obstacles that stand in the way of our goals, and then figuring out, how do I solve that problem? We may not, let's say we may not have enough money to go to the university to study what we wish to study. So what do? We've got the resolve, we've got plenty of mindfulness, but we need to figure out a way to get that financial support to enable that to happen. And again, there's any number of ways in which this could be done, but we need to overcome what seems to be an obstacle and achieve our goals through our imagination in the first instance. And then, as we'll see, through perseverance, through intuition, and through experimentation. So the Buddha describes creativity, as I'm going to call it, as consisting of 4 steps. And these are called the iddhipada, the steps of creativity, or traditionally magical thinking or magical power. But let's forget about that. Creativity. And what are these 4 steps? The first step is to aspire, or is to long for or desire a particular result. We go back to our example, getting on a degree program in a university. First of all, we need to aspire to that. We need to want that. We need to desire it in some way. The word the Buddha uses is chanda, which is the common word for desire. So again, in this model, desire is okay. Desire is actually something you need in order to achieve your goals. If you don't have a picture of where you're heading and a desire to attain that, you won't get anywhere. Aspiration, though, just longing for something, is not enough. You have to persevere at that. You have to work hard to somehow bring that aspiration to its fulfillment. And this perseverance is basically trying out different options, different approaches, trying out different solutions to how this might work. It also has to do, I think, a great deal with incubating something. Let's take a mathematical problem. You've been given whether it's at work or whether it's at college, you've got to solve a mathematical problem. And you struggle away, you use all the tools that you have, and you just don't get anywhere. And then you go to, then you go to bed and you sleep, and then at the morning when you wake up, suddenly you get the answer. In other words, what goes on once we set our minds to the realization of a particular goal is that even when we're not thinking about it, our brain, or some subconscious layer of our neural activity, is pondering it, is working it out, is playing out options and things of which we are completely unaware. We could call this incubation. But it'll only be incubated if there is a conscious effort put in to focus ourselves on that goal. So perseverance here is not just pushing ourselves, it's rather more about creating the conditions that will enable some insight to arise that will help us reach our goal. And so the third step in creativity is called intuition. Intuition is my translation here for the word citta, which we could also translate as soul, or sometimes mind. But I think in this case, it refers to those moments in any kind of creative process where suddenly we have an we figure out the mathematical problem. We figure out what we have to do in order to get the place at university, whatever it might be. But we have what we sometimes call aha moments, moments in which, after much effort, something becomes very clear. We now have got an insight into how we can creatively realize our goal. And that intuition, I think, is not the result of having thought a lot or having forced ourselves with a lot of effort, but it's something that stems from deeper within our heart, our soul, our chitta, our deep mind, that then gives us a clue or a pointer as to how to proceed. And that then leads us into the fourth stage of creativity, which is called experimentation. In other words, we follow those intuitions and then we experiment. Then we try different ways of applying that insight into the actual nature of the world that we are working with in our discussions with others, exploring different ways of communicating these ideas. It may have to do with doing more psychological work on ourselves. It might have to do with actually creating or building or designing some machine. It could be anything. But we have to experiment. We can't just have the brilliant insight. We have to be able to make that brilliant insight into something real that can fulfill our resolve, our desire, and at the same time generate something that's never quite been thought of in that way before. Creativity is what gives birth to something new, whether it be something within ourselves, whether it be something we invent or create in the world, or a book that we write. It's through the process of creativity that we give birth to new ways of being in the world, new ways of seeing the world, new technologies or techniques that can help people fulfill their lives in different ways. So we're going to leave it at that today, but let's just briefly go over what we've looked at. We've looked at the 4 tasks. We've understood, or I've suggested, that these are essentially ethical in nature. We've seen that the Buddhist virtue that lies at the heart of this ethics is care, which is compared to an elephant's footprint. We've looked at what it means to fully know or to embrace or to comprehend, that is to do so without attachment, aversion, or opinionatedness. It's to embrace the world without reactivity, to live, as it were, more and more from a nirvanic or deathless perspective, rather than being pushed and pulled by whatever impulse or thought or emotion takes over at any given moment. But we've also considered how comprehending life or embracing life, this first task, is not just about how we work in the present moment, let's say in our mindful meditation practice, but it has to do with opening up a larger reach to recognize how this task is about how we form ourselves as a human person over the entire course of our life. In this sense, we might understand mindfulness, resolve, and creativity as being core elements of education. And if you think about it, education comes from the Latin educare, which means to lead you out into a new experience. It's to draw out your potential and make your potentials actual in the world. There's a German term, Bildung, which again is a notion of education in which the whole person is educated, not just the intellect, in which you become a fully rounded person in your inner life and in the life you share in your community. And the ways in which this process occurs is built around mindfulness, understood in its broadest sense, resolve in terms of constantly coming back to consider what matters most for you, and creativity, the capacity you have to identify your goals, to aspire to them, to nurture them, to incubate them, to persevere in them, which leads to intuition or insight that then gives you a fresh sense of how to proceed, that then allows you to work towards actually realizing your goal in practice. So that's all I would want to share with you now. I have, of course, spoken for 10 minutes longer than I promised. Hope that hasn't been too overbearing for you. And I'd like now to open up the room, open up the space for your reflections and comments. So we can do this. You can put you've got a on the bottom of your Zoom screen, there is a virtual hand somewhere. Reactions, is it under reactions? Yeah. Or else you can just put up your hand and if you punch the little button, isn't that correct, Mangesh? Oh, there you go.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, yes, yes.
Okay. So Santosh, Dr. Santosh Kumar Pulpagar, can you put your video on, please, and then we can see you. Hi,
Sure.
Santosh. Okay. Lovely to see you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brother Mangesh, for organizing this. Uh, so some reflections and maybe a question also, actually, Stephen. First of all, thank you very much, Stephen, for this very, very insightful session. You have talked about, let's say, 4 tasks, and one of the tasks is, embracing the life.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you're talking about mindfulness, resolution, and then, creativity being the most important thing. And creativity, you said, we need to have desire, we need to have certain goal. Uh, these are some of the, things that are understood. So when we say embracing the life, see, for example, many things are happening to us in life. And then the life offers us a lot of possibilities.
Yeah.
Lot of options are there. For example, whether to attend this session or go with some friends or something. Life is offering us. And then these possibilities are there, and then we have to choose one of the possibility and maybe act on it. Uh, and you also talked about do what is the most important for you. Like you gave the example of Buddha. He decided what is the most important for him to do at that stage. And I think in various stages of our life, also, what is most important could also change. So maybe the question is, when we say that embrace the life, and at the same time we know the life offers us possibilities. Life offers us possibilities. At the same time, we can also generate possibilities in the life. So I just would like to get your perspective on, whether we should accept the possibilities given by the life, or should we also make a conscious effort to generate certain possibilities for ourselves and people around us?
It's a very good question, and I think you point to something that is evidently the case, and that is that life is something that presents us with many options at any one time. And so just to say embrace your options is not going to be very helpful. And that's why I think we need something like resolve, because resolve is basically asking us to reflect on what our priorities really are. And I think for a lot of the time, especially in social situations with friends, someone says, hey, let's go down to the bar, or whatever it might be. And there's a kind of collective pressure that that's clearly what people want to do. But in your heart of hearts, you had actually decided that you were going to go home and you were going to do some work that was important for you, that you may not talk too much about with your friends. And strangely, it's the pressure of your friends that pushes you to go down to the bar, rather than your own deepest interest, which is to go back and do whatever work it was you wanted to do. So the question of being offered different possibilities all the time, which is a feature of our lives today, I think has to always be seen in an increased sense for what really matters for us. I think some of this is a question of trial and error. You know, you go down to the bar with your friends and then you feel kind of disappointed. You didn't have a particularly good time. You were always feeling guilty that you weren't doing what you really wanted to do. And that in itself will, over time, give you more and more confidence in just following your own lights. But also, I think if we really do take these ideas seriously, then I think that will give us a much sounder basis within ourselves to be able to make those decisions more clearly, more distinctively, so that we wouldn't have to really be torn in two different directions. Maybe life is such that we'll always have some situations where it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. We just don't know. Life doesn't lend itself to simple solutions. So, yeah, I think it's a question of finding a balance between what our priorities are, what we're being called by life to do in many cases, what our challenges are being presented to us that we have to face, and somehow figuring out through experience and reflection and study and discussions in groups like this as how we might best respond to life's challenges when we are next forced to come up with a decision. So again, there's no simple answer, but I do think it's important for what we're discussing here to reflect on that. So thank you. So Prashant, could you put your camera on and ask your question, please? Prashant Tambe. There you are. Okay, Prashant.
Yeah, Stephen, thank you for that very, very wonderful lecture. Am I audible?
Very audible, yeah.
So, actually, it was indeed very, very assuring when you said that in Buddha's time, not just the monks, but even the laymen, they reached a certain level of knowledge, you know. That was very assuring for me being a layman, because here what we read or what we get to hear that only monks can reach to certain level, and laymen, it is very difficult path for them, and they have to wear robe and discard worldly life. But when you said that there were around 21, you said 21 people who read 32 or something?
21. I mean, they list 21 in the text. Yeah.
Okay. So it's assuring. That is on a lighter note to say. However, my question is that when you said that we have to embrace life with its entirety, and you mentioned that term, many times in your lecture. So I would like to know what do you mean by that? Embracing life entirety.
Its entirety.
Yeah, entirety. Yeah.
What I mean there, I mean, what we often have a tendency to do is when we meet we meet a life situation, let's say an encounter with a difficult friend. Very easily, we narrow our attention down to one or two things about the difficult friend. We get locked into a kind of tunnel vision. This is the guy who did this. This is the guy who did that. This is the guy who said this. This is the guy who said that. And we limit them. We're not seeing the person in their entirety. We're actually just seeing a very small bit of the person. We only relate to that. We forget that this is a person who probably suffers like we do, who might have had all kinds of traumas in his or her past. We don't really, we're not open to that. We're only concentrating on this very narrow picture we have of who this person is and how they're problematic. And you can extend that idea to pretty much anything. You look at some political situation, for example, and it's very easy to get sucked into just seeing it from one perspective, depending on your political views or the politicians you like and don't like. It's very easy to get very narrow and very emotional, and tunnel vision is what happens. So encompassing life in its entirety is a reminder to recognize that all life situations, all people we meet in life situations, all social events that are occurring in India or elsewhere in the world, these are not things that can be readily understood in simplistic, narrow terms. We need to have at least the courage, the willingness to see the bigger picture, as we frame it today. So in its entirety, let's say the bigger picture, to try to always take into account factors that we might be unaware of, or factors that we would rather not know about. And this also occurs to oneself, in our own sense of who we are. We tend to listen to your inner monologue about Prashant. It's all very much narrowed on Prashant's wants, and Prashant likes this and Prashant doesn't want that. We tend to get lost in the detail rather than looking at the whole of our life, how I will be impacting the lives of others. I may not be conscious of that. Is to try to have a more open, a broader perspective on all life situations, so that we can see the complexity of things, which might also lead to our not being so opinionated, reactive, narrow-minded. That's kind of what I'm getting at there, but we'll come back to that as we continue.
Yes.
Thank
you so much. Thank you so much.
That's a great pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, Minal,
Yes, hi. Yes,
Hi,
yes.
Minal.
Hello. First of
Hi.
all, thank you for the beautiful discourse you gave. My question is regarding mindfulness. Am I audible?
Yes, very audible.
Yes. So regarding mindfulness, one can be aware of simple daily things one is doing, as the Zen tradition says, and then there are all sort of meditations, Vipassana meditation, breathing meditation, body scan meditation. I have been practicing these meditations at my own pace, with my regular life, and I have seen a tremendous change in me. So my question is, how much it is important? I mean, if you want to pursue the path, and if you really believe, if one really believes that it is very much possible to pursue the path and bring a change about in your own life, how much important it is to go in for longer retreats and studying under some teacher, some guidance? How much, I mean, yeah, you can get an idea of what I want to ask.
No, thank you very much, Mina. It's a very good question, and but there is no general answer to that question, I'm afraid. There's no kind of rule book or handbook that says you must do, 3 weeks of this and then a year of that. Because each person has their own specific needs. When I was talking about resolve, then basically that is, becoming clear, focusing upon what really matters most for you in life. If you can answer that question, what matters most for me in this life, I think a lot of your other questions would fall into place.
That's a tricky one, yeah.
I suspect. I'm not saying that you could necessarily are going to, what matters most to me in my life is also a difficult question.
Yes,
There's probably many things. But the point is, it's about getting your priorities straight. And one of the meditations that I found most helpful as a Buddhist monk was the meditation on death, on the certainty of the time, the certainty of death, and the uncertainty of its time.
Yes.
And then leaving yourself hanging with the question, if death is certain and the time of death is uncertain, what should I do? How should I live? That's another way of putting the question, what matters most to me? If you put it in the light of your own death, it becomes much more personal. If you knew you just had a year to live, let's say,
Yes.
what would you do? And I think those sorts of questions are very helpful to pursue, not because you'll necessarily get the right answer, but because they will somehow allow you to frame your life from another perspective. I mean, go back to your own beginnings with mindfulness. I don't know why you started doing mindfulness, but there must have been something in your life that led you to think, maybe I should give this a go. Or maybe some friends suggested it, or who knows. And then when you practice it, you find, hey, this works. But you need, I think, also to keep reminding yourself, what question in my life, what really important question in my life is mindfulness an answer to? Sometimes we become too preoccupied with the techniques of mindfulness and the lengths of retreat, and we lose sight of what it was in our life that led us to do mindfulness in the first place. And I think we need to keep coming back to that. And sometimes when you do meditation or you do mindfulness, some days it's great, other days it's really boring. And
Yes, indeed.
and at those points, you need to say, why am I doing this? To get clear in your mind again as to where the source of your inspiration lies. And I think the more that we can get clear about those questions, the more it'll be easier to answer these, how much should I meditate? Is it useful to go on a retreat? Should I study with a teacher? These are all absolutely important questions, but I think they must always be asked in relation to actual felt urgencies within your own life, in the life of your family, your friends, or whatever. Not just something that for which, well, I like mindfulness, so I'll ask my teacher what I should do next. Well, that might be helpful, but I think it also really has to, whatever is suggested, it has to speak to the core of yourself that took you to the mindfulness in the first place. I agree with you. I think mindfulness is an incredibly valuable and central part of this practice. And as we'll see, when we look at the different virtues associated with the different tasks and the different paths, we'll find that mindfulness is the only one that appears on all 4 tasks.
Yes.
So there's something about mindfulness that is not secondary. It's right at the very core. And I feel that people like John Kabat-Zinn and others, and Mr. Goenka, of course, as well, who've introduced mindfulness into the world of everyday life. We're not monks.
Yes.
I don't think there's any monks here. It's been, I think, an incredible way of rediscovering an insight the Buddha had 2,500 years ago that can actually be shown to work in the lives of ordinary people who may know nothing about Buddhism, but they find that this exercise has a transformative effect on the quality of their life. So what I'm trying to do here is to build on that. I feel that I'm not really talking to Buddhists, people who've already got a tradition and a teacher and a practice. I'm not really, they're fine. I'm really interested in speaking to people who have stumbled into Buddhism through mindfulness or something similar, who are not, they're not necessarily want to join another religion, but they want a practice, an ethics, a philosophy that'll be built around the experience of mindfulness. And that perhaps is your situation. I mean, I don't know, but I meet many people now who come from all sorts of different backgrounds and jobs and roles and interests, but what unites them is the discovery of mindfulness. So the 4 tasks are really a way of expanding the idea of mindfulness to encompass the primary virtues that the Buddha taught as the tools for leading a full, flourishing life as a human person in a human society in the world today. So thank you. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Okay, Mayur, could you switch on your camera, please? Mayur Mankar? Ah, there you are. Hi. I can't hear you. Your microphone must be off. I still can't hear you. Could you, if you could try writing the question in the chat?
Yes, Stephen, am I audible now?
Oh, yes, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Yes. Actually, thank you so much for the wonderful study. And right now my microphone is not working, so that's why I would not be able to speak through earphone. My
Okay.
question is followed to the last question, the question of Minal. Actually, while taking the study, while talking about mindfulness, you have mentioned the word stillness.
Yeah.
So, so my question is how to be mindful even while taking the action.
We'll come on to that. I mean, that's because if you look at I described these 21 people, and the text says that these 21 people went about their business from the perspective of the deathless, or from a nirvana, or the non-reactive space. In other words, these are people who were able to stay still and focused within themselves, and yet be fully engaged in the activities of life, of the world. And that's something that you can't just decide to do. Some people have a natural disposition that way, but most of us will have to work on that. We'll probably find that when we're sitting in our room practicing mindfulness, it's relatively easy to be still and quiet there. But as soon as we get back into, let's say, our office or our family life or going out with friends, and all of that just disappears. And we're just running around, reacting, enjoying ourselves, but we kind of lost touch with that still center. So this is very much at the heart of the practice of these 4 tasks. And the third task, which is seeing the stopping of reactivity, is the task that where we actually work on cultivating that particular skill. In other words, learning through mindfulness or other meditation techniques to find an inner stillness and spaciousness that becomes more and more constant within us. I think everybody, I mean, the fact that you're interested in these things and have signed up for this course implies that you already have some sense of that. You know that on a good day, you can be quite focused and still even when there's chaos going on all around you. And that can be quite, satisfying and also, I think, a very powerful experience. You're not caught up in all of the noise and the different opinions, but you're able to somehow keep your cool, as they say. And so this is something we can train, something we can develop, and something that is very much central to this practice. But I have to confess, in my own life, I've been doing this now for 50 years or so, it requires ongoing work. And we'll address this in the third session. That it sounds very nice being mindful and so on, but it actually requires a commitment. It requires effort. It requires discipline. It requires regularity, and these things can be very challenging. Especially in a busy, hectic world that we live in now. And all the more reason it's important to focus on them.
Yes, thank you so much. And does it require continuous practice? Means to get that kind of skill,
Um,
consistency?
I think in some sense, yes, unfortunately. But by continuous practice, I don't mean that you spend, 10 hours a day sitting on a cushion meditating. It means to find ways in which to remind yourself of what you're doing, to interrupt your daily activities every now and again with a moment of quiet. Maybe just watch your breath for a few breaths. Thich Nhat Hanh has this practice of when you hear a bell, even if it's your telephone, you wait for it to ring 3 times before picking it up. Whereas normally you hear the phone ring and you immediately grab it. So introduce gaps and interruptions into the busyness of your life. Don't let yourself be constantly overwhelmed by the sense of other people's urgency and pressure. It's challenging, it's difficult, it's not always appreciated. But I do feel that if we're going to take seriously the idea of adopting a more mindful perspective on our life as a whole, that will require some regular work on our behalf. Formal sitting, maybe once a day or twice a day, but also moments during the day when we just stop and pause and breathe and take stock of how we are in that moment. We have time for one more question. Ritesh?
Yeah, thank you, Michael, for this wonderful talk. I hope you can hear me okay. Not just
I can hear you very well, yes. Very
okay, perfect. I'm kind of curious about the first part that you mentioned, the one that sets us off, which is mindfulness.
well.
And it's a slightly technical question, so let me know if you will cover this later at a later session. But can a mindful moment have any content, any cognitive content in it? Or does it have to hover over all cognitive content? In other words, you don't see the tree or you don't see the computer, but you just see seeing. You're just aware of the seeing. I'm kind of curious of your view and also what you know from the suttas.
Okay, well, if we go back to the 4 mindfulnesses that I briefly sketched, the first one is to be mindful of the physical world and one's body, which is all content. And it's not to be aware just of seeing, but it's to be aware of trees and flowers and leaves and grasses. It's to be aware of all of the minute details of life. And I feel that what mindfulness has been very helpful to me is in that it is highlighted and it has enhanced my appreciation of the detail of life, the little things that we tend to overlook. When we do mindfulness meditation on sound, for example, we just listen to whatever sounds are occurring in the moment, even when it's relatively quiet, just to attune ourselves to the minutiae of rhythms and cadences and so on. And the same is true with our exploring our feelings and our mental states. All of this is content. All of this is cognitive content. We are recognizing that I'm not feeling so great today. We're recognizing I've got, a lot of thoughts are coming up about my mother, for example. It's cognitive content. And so the practice of mindfulness is not to get rid of cognitive content. There are meditations in Buddhism and other traditions where you just try to be purely in the seeing, the hearing, the smelling, and nothing else. I mean, that's the third mindfulness, perhaps, where you're aware of your mental states. But in most cases, mindfulness is very much about heightening your cognitive capacity to see clearly, to see without prejudice, to see without fear or attachment. And in that way, the object, the cognitive object, is rendered more lucid, more clear. And that allows you to then enter into a different kind of relationship to it. Mindfulness is of value in making the world more vivid and bright and clear, even the difficult, the suffering and the pain and the conflict as well, in order that you can see it more clearly, be with it more clearly, and to respond to it in a less reactive, less prejudicial or harmful way. But we'll keep coming back to mindfulness because, as I said to the previous questioner, it's the thread that ties the rest together, as we'll see. I think that's a good place to stop there. Mangesh,
Yes.
thank you very much for hosting this. I have one question. I sent to Mangesh yesterday a chart. Did you get that, Mangesh?
I didn't check my email, but I will check and I will let you know. You
Okay.
my email?
I sent it to you yesterday afternoon.
Okay, okay, okay.
It's called the Cartography of Care.
Okay.
The Cartography of Care.
Yeah.
And if you could send it to everybody on this
I will do
course, I'd be very grateful. And that way you'll be able to see the map that I've
Good,
been
good.
drawing up, which shows you where all these different qualities and paths and tasks
Great.
are situated. And I see that as the map for this course as well.
I will just check. I will just send after some time. But before we conclude, I would like to thank you, Stephen, sadhu, for having delivered this very beautiful lecture. And as a Pali student, I could sense a lot of getting clarity on a lot of things. Like, Appamata or Appamad is a very second chapter of the Dhammapada. And,
Yes, exactly.
second chapter of Dhammapada, as you know, and it links directly with the Amata. Appamado
Yeah.
Amata Padam.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's a very good point. No, that's absolutely right.
And the kind of thread that you brought through in terms of Appamad and in terms of the path. So basically in the Buddha and Dhamma, Baba Ambedkar relates this first discourse in terms of the three paths: the path of purity, the path of righteousness, and path of virtue. And I found this parallel very interesting that you just deliberated. So I request all of you to kindly join the next session. And if you have anything, you can read, you can go through this lecture, which I'm going to upload very soon. And this is a lovely journey. Thank you, Stephen, and all of you for joining in today. And see you next week.
See you next week. Have a good week. I hope it's
Thank
not
you.
too hot in India.
Thank you. Thank you.
All the best.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.